Welcome everyone. I'm excited to welcome you to today's presentation. Today, we'll be exploring the important topic of Malaki Zakaah al-Maal. This is a key subject that relates to continuous learning and development. Over the course of this session, we'll cover the basics of Malaki Zakaah al-Maal, its significance, and how it can impact our understanding and practice. So, let's get started and dive into this fascinating subject together. Let's explore the concept of zakat on earth produce, as explained by the Prophet FDFA. He mentioned that when land is irrigated naturally, whether by rainwater, water channels, or if the land is naturally wet near a water source, the obligation of zakat is 1/10, or ushr. This means, if your land falls into this category, you owe 1/10 of the produce as zakat. However, if the land is irrigated by a well, which is a more controlled water source, then the zakat drops to half of an ushr, or 1/20 of the produce. This distinction highlights how the method of irrigation affects the amount of zakat due. It's important to understand these differences to fulfill our religious obligations correctly. This teaching emphasizes fairness in how we calculate zakat based on the means of irrigation, connecting it to our broader duty of charity and social responsibility. Today, we're focusing on the rules regarding zakat on crops, specifically according to the Malaki school of thought. Zakat on crops must be paid on the day they are harvested, which is a crucial point to remember. The Malaki scholar explains that zakat becomes due when certain conditions are met, such as when the palms are appraised, the grapes are in good condition, and the olives are black or nearly black. At this stage, the crop has started to ripen and no longer needs water, indicating that it's ready for harvest and zakat is due. Ibn Abd Salam confirms that this is the well-known position among scholars. On the other hand, Ibn Maslama offers a slightly different view. He states that zakat is only obligatory when the crops are actually harvested, and specifically on dates, only when they are cut. So, to sum up, the key points are that zakat is due at the time of harvest, but the exact timing can depend on different scholarly opinions. The process involves first determining the soundness of the crop, then estimating its value, and finally cutting or harvesting it. Ripening happens before harvest, which is the moment zakat becomes obligatory. Understanding these details helps us see how the timing and conditions of zakat on crops are linked to the growth stages and different scholarly interpretations, all of which fit into the broader theme of ensuring zakat is paid correctly and timely. Livestock includes camels, cattle, sheep, and goats. Zakat is obligatory on both money and livestock once a year, specifically after completing a full lunar year. According to Zakaah, the key condition for livestock zakat is that the collector must come to the well-known position of the livestock if it exists and arrives there. If not, then zakat becomes obligatory after a year by mutual agreement. It's important to note that zakat is due on the offspring of the livestock, but only if the mother animal has been in your possession for a full year. Interestingly, there is no zakat owed on horses for a Muslim. Zakat is applicable to all livestock, whether they are foddered or used as work animals. In the Malaki school of thought, zakat is owed on both money and livestock, emphasizing its comprehensive approach to obligatory charity. Understanding these points helps us see how zakat on livestock is not just about the animals themselves, but also about ensuring the proper timing and conditions are met for it to be obligatory. Let's go through the key points on this slide regarding zakat on camels, according to Malaki jurisprudence. First, there is no zakat due if you have less than 5 camels. So, if the herd is below this number, you're exempt from zakat on camels. When the herd reaches between 5 and 9 camels, you are required to give either a sheep or a goat, depending on which animal is more common in your area. The animal should be in its second year. It's important to note that if the owner chooses to give a camel instead of the required sheep or goat, that is permissible. This is because a camel is considered the same type of property and often has a higher value than the obligation. For herds of 10 to 25 camels, the obligation increases. 2 sheep or goats are due for 10 to 14 camels, and 3 for 15 to 19 camels. When the herd reaches 20 to 25 camels, the zakat due is 4 sheep or goats. Moving to the next category, for herds of 25 to 35 camels, the obligation shifts to giving a female camel in its second year, called a bint makhad. If a bint makhad isn't available, then a male camel in its third year, called ibn laban, can be used instead. If neither of these are available or if they are damaged, then the collector has some discretion. He may accept a male camel that has completed its second year and has begun its third, or if none are available, he can charge the owner for a bint makhad. The collector then makes a judgment based on the availability. If he sees fit, he can accept an ibn laban, but if not, he can still require the owner to give a bint makhad. The key takeaway here is that the specifics can vary depending on what is available, but the overall principle is to give a camel or its equivalent in sheep or goats, depending on the herd size. This detailed understanding helps us see how zakat on camels is structured and how flexibility is built into the rulings to accommodate different situations. Today, I want to walk you through some important details about the zakat on camels, focusing on the specific categories and requirements. For camels in the range of 36 to 45, the requirement is to give a female camel that is between 2 and 5 years old, which is called a bint laban. It's important to understand that when we talk about the shortfall here, it's 10, meaning that the camel should have completed 2 full years and have just begun its third year. So, the shortfall at the end is 9, which indicates how many more years or camels are needed to meet the obligation. Moving to the next category, for 46 to 60 camels, the requirement is a female camel in its fourth year, known as a hikah, which can carry loads and bear children. An interesting point here is that paying with 2 bint labans, even if they are equal in value to the required camel, does not satisfy this obligation. The key is that the camel must have completed its third year and be in its fourth. The shortfall in this case is 14, which again reflects how much more is needed to fulfill the zakat. Finally, for 61 to 75 camels, the requirement is a female in its fifth year, called a jada. Here, what matters is that the camel has completed its fourth year and begun the fifth. This category marks the last of the categories used for paying zakat on camels. The shortfall here is also 14, emphasizing the specific age and maturity needed for the zakat obligation. Throughout these categories, the emphasis is on the age and maturity of the camels, ensuring they meet particular standards before they can be used to fulfill zakat. These details are critical for proper compliance and understanding of the zakat requirements on camels, especially in the Malaki school of thought. All right, let's look at the specifics of zakat on camels, according to the Malaki school. For camels between 76 and 90, the requirement is to give 2 female camels in their third year, known as bint laban. Now, if your herd falls into this range, keep in mind that there is a shortfall of 14 camels. Moving on to the next bracket, for those with 91 to 120 camels, the obligation increases slightly. You need to give 2 hikahs, which are a certain type of young camel, and in this range, the shortfall is 29 camels. Now, if you have more than 120 camels, the rules become a bit more nuanced. For every 50 camels above that, you give 1 hikah, and for every 40 camels, you give 1 bint laban. So the key takeaway here is that as the number of camels increases, the zakat obligations also increase, but according to specific ratios. This method helps us understand how to calculate zakat based on different herd sizes and ensures we're fulfilling our obligations properly. It's a systematic way that connects directly to our overall theme of fulfilling Islamic duties accurately and fairly. Today, we will discuss the nisab for zakat on cattle. The key point to remember is that there is no zakat due on less than 30 cattle. Once you have 30 or more, the obligation begins. Specifically, with 30 to 40 cattle, you are required to give 1 in its third year, known as tabi. This means that if you have exactly 30 cattle, you must give 1 calf from the third year. Interestingly, although the term suggests it should be male, the well-known position is that it is not a prerequisite for the calf to be male. The main requirement is that it has completed 2 years. When the total reaches 40 cattle, the obligation shifts. You must give a cow that is in its 4th year, called musina or thania. Only females are acceptable for this. So at 40, the zakat is on a 4-year-old female cow. If you don't have a 4-year-old cow available, you are obliged to provide a better alternative, such as a 5-year-old cow. According to some scholars like Ibn Habib and Abdul Wahhab, the musina is considered to have completed its full 4 years. Now, for more than 40 cattle, say 50 or more, the rules expand. For every 40 cattle, you owe a musina, and for every 30, a tabi. For example, if you have 50 cattle, there's no additional zakat beyond the base obligation. When you reach 60 cattle, you owe 2 tabi. At 70, you owe 1 tabi and 1 musina, and if you go up to 80, there are 2 musina. Essentially, as the number increases, the amount of zakat due scales accordingly, following these specific ratios. Understanding these thresholds and their corresponding obligations is crucial for accurately fulfilling zakat on cattle. It helps connect the overall theme of proper zakat calculation and ensures we meet our religious responsibilities correctly. Let's look at the nisab thresholds for sheep and goats according to Malaki jurisprudence. First, there is no zakat due until you have 40 animals. Once you pass 40, you need to give 1 animal in its 5th year, called jada, or 1 in its 4th year, called thaniya. This rule applies up to a maximum of 120 animals. Importantly, neither male nor female animals are specified for this obligation. Ibn Umar explained that this rule was clarified in the context of camels, but it applies here as well. Moving to the second nisab, which is from 120 to 200 animals. If your herd is between these numbers, you owe 2 animals in zakat. So, if you have 150 sheep or goats, for example, you'd need to give 2. The shortfall here is 80 animals, meaning your herd is 80 short of the next obligation. And this shortfall is clarified further as 79 in other contexts. But the key point is understanding how much over or under you are relative to the nisab. Now, for the third nisab, which covers 200 to 300 animals. If you have between 201 and 300 sheep or goats, you need to give 3 animals. And for every additional 100 animals beyond 300, you give 1 more animal. For example, if you have 399 animals, you'd give 3, and for 400, you'd give 4. Similarly, at 500 animals, you'd give 5, and so on. This system helps us understand how zakat scales with the size of your herd, ensuring fairness and proportionality. Connecting this to our overall discussion, it highlights how zakat on livestock is structured to support equitable giving based on wealth thresholds. Now, let's discuss the key points regarding zakat on animals, specifically focusing on shortfalls. First, it's important to understand that there is no zakat required on any shortfall of animals. That is, when the number of animals falls below the nisab, the minimum threshold for zakat. This ruling applies across all the types of livestock we've mentioned earlier. The shortfall refers to the difference between the actual number of animals and the nisab. It's a technical term used to describe any deficit in reaching the zakat obligation. Essentially, if your animals are below the nisab, you are not obliged to pay zakat on them. Next, let's look at how animals are categorized for zakat purposes. Sheep and goats are considered as one category, and this is based on consensus among scholars. This classification is supported by the statement in At-Taqiq, which explains that the names used by the Prophet include both sheep and goats together. The rule here is straightforward. For every 40 goats, 1 sheep is due for zakat. Similarly, cattle and buffaloes are grouped together as one category, again by agreement among scholars. The reasoning is that the general name used by the Prophet encompasses all these animals. The specific rule is that there is a zakat obligation for each 30 cattle or buffaloes. Finally, camels are divided into 2 categories, Bactrian and dromedary camels. These are considered as one category for zakat purposes as well, especially in the context of the people of Khorasan, since the term used by the Prophet covers both types. The key point here is that the classification of camels also follows this combined approach. In summary, understanding these categories and the concept of shortfalls helps us accurately determine zakat obligations on livestock, ensuring we fulfill our religious duties properly. Let's explore the concept of zakat for joint owners, or what we refer to as Malaki. When owners of herds combine their animals and pay zakat collectively, they settle the share each must pay based on the number of animals they own. This means that instead of each paying separately, they work together to determine the total zakat owed, which is then divided according to their individual ownership. Now, the partnership has some important preconditions. It's taken from both owners as if it were from a single owner, meaning the calculation considers their combined animals in terms of amount, age, and category, just like one person owning all the animals. For example, if each owner has 40 sheep, then only one sheep is due for the entire group, and each owner pays 1/3 of that share. Another example is with camels. If each of 3 owners has 36 camels, then a jada, or zakat obligation, is due, and each owes half. Similarly, if one owner has 80 sheep and another has 40 goats, then only one sheep is due for the entire partnership, with 2/3 owed by one owner and 1/3 by the other. Partnership can sometimes lighten the zakat burden. For instance, if each owner has 40 sheep, individually they would each owe 1 sheep, totaling 2. But together, they only owe 1, effectively benefiting from the partnership. Conversely, in some cases, the burden can be heavier. If each has 120 sheep, each would owe 1 sheep on their own, but combined, they owe 3 sheep when working together. There are also situations where the partnership doesn't change the zakat owed. For example, if each has 100 sheep, each owing 1 zakat, then collectively, they still owe only 1 zakat, no benefit or burden change. Finally, a key condition for this kind of joint zakat calculation is that each owner must have the nisab, which is the minimum amount of wealth required to be obliged to pay zakat. This ensures fairness and consistency in the zakat obligations for both individual and joint owners. Let's discuss the concept of settlement according to the state of the herd. When the time for zakat comes, animals that were mixed together should not be separated, nor should separate herds be mixed out of fear of paying zakat. This is because, as Ibn Shash explained, at the end of the year, adjusting the herd by joining or separating can actually reduce the amount of zakat owed. If such mixing or separating leads to a lower zakat, then the herds should be restored to their original condition to reflect their true state. For example, if 2 men each own 100 animals and they separate at the end of the year, they might each be obliged to pay for 2 sheep. But if they join their herds at the end of the year, the combined herd might mean they owe only 3 sheep in total. The key point here is that the goal is to accurately reflect the herd's true state, not to manipulate it to pay less zakat. Another important point is that zakat isn't due unless the animals reach a certain minimum. As the Prophet said, there is no zakat on less than 5 camels. So, animals below that threshold are not liable for zakat. It's also important to note that the animals must be of the same stud, shared grazing and resting areas, and the partnership is based on friendship and mutual agreement, not to avoid zakat. Lastly, for joint owners, especially in the Malaki school of thought, the zakat is calculated based on the combined ownership, considering the animals collectively as part of the herd, which emphasizes fairness and shared responsibility. This way, zakat remains a just obligation that reflects the true ownership and condition of the herd. Now let's talk about baby animals and how they relate to zakat. A baby sheep or goat is not taken as zakat, but it is counted when numbering the owner's flock. Similarly, baby calves or camels are not taken as zakat, but they are included in the herd count. This way, the focus is on the overall size of the herd rather than individual young animals. Moving on, certain animals are also exempt from being taken as zakat. These include young billy goats, thin old females, pregnant females, a ram used for breeding, a sheep or goat that is being fattened for slaughter, and a female nursing her young. Importantly, zakat is not taken from the best or the worst of a person's property. The idea here is to protect both the rights of the wealthy and the poor. If the owner gives the best animals willingly, that is acceptable. But if they give the worst, that is not permissible. If all the property is of similar quality, either all good or all bad, the owner is obliged to give a middle quality item. And if they refuse, they can be compelled to pay zakat. Next, let's clarify a common question. Can the owner pay cash or goods instead of the animals? The answer is no. For zakat on animals, you cannot substitute the animal with its monetary price or other goods, like grains. If the collector forces the owner to pay the price or something else, then that can satisfy the obligation, Allah willing. However, paying voluntarily the price instead of the animal does not fulfill the requirement, according to Ibn al-Hajib. It's only acceptable if it's done by force, then it's considered valid. Finally, I want to mention the Malaki school's stance. They prohibit forms of payment that are not the actual animals or their equivalent. This emphasizes the importance of fulfilling zakat in its proper form, maintaining the integrity of the obligation, and ensuring its spiritual and social purpose is preserved. Now, let's discuss the key points regarding zakat on agricultural produce. No zakat is due on any amount of dates or grains that is less than 5 wasks, which is roughly 609.84 kilograms. This threshold is important because it determines when zakat becomes obligatory. When it comes to wheat, barley, and sickle barley, they are all grouped together for zakat purposes, meaning they are treated as one category. Similarly, pulses such as peas, chickpeas, lentils, grass peas, broad beans, lupins, beans, and sesame seeds are considered a single category for zakat calculation. For dates and raisins, zakat is payable, and if there are various types of dates in a garden, you should pay zakat based on the middle quality. If there's only one type, regardless of its quality, you take zakat from it directly. You don't need to choose the best or the middle. The zakat is taken from what is available. When it comes to rice, sorghum, and millet, these are considered separate categories. Each one is treated individually, and their zakat calculations are made separately, not combined. Olives are a special case. You pay zakat on olives when their amount reaches 5 wasks, and the zakat is paid in oil. Interestingly, there's no need for the oil itself to reach the nisab weight. What matters is that the grain, like olives, reaches the nisab threshold. The same applies to sesame seeds and radish seeds pressed for oil. Zakat is payable once the quantity reaches the nisab. This also extends to other pressed oils, which are subject to zakat when their amount reaches the nisab. In summary, understanding these categories and thresholds helps ensure that zakat is calculated correctly and reflects the specific rulings for each type of produce. As we look at this slide, I want to highlight a key concept about how zakat is paid on agricultural produce. If the produce doesn't have oil, like the olives of Egypt, zakat is paid based on their market value or price. Think of it this way. It's similar to fresh dates, grapes, or green broad beans from Egypt that haven't been dried. Even if these items are sold for less than their actual value, zakat is still due if the amount reaches the threshold of 5 wasks. Now, if the produce is worth less than that, then no zakat is obligatory, even if its selling price is much higher than what would normally trigger zakat. This emphasizes that zakat is calculated based on the estimated value or weight, not just the selling price. It's also important to note that, generally, you do not pay zakat on fruits and vegetables, only on certain farm produce when specific conditions are met. This distinction is crucial for understanding how zakat applies to agricultural goods. This concept ties into the broader theme of the presentation, which is about proper zakat calculation and ensuring we meet our obligations accurately. There is no zakat on gold if your holdings are less than 20 dinars. Once your gold reaches 20 dinars, you are required to pay half a dinar, which is equivalent to 1/40th of the total amount. Any additional gold beyond that amount is calculated on the same basis. Similarly, for silver, there is no zakat if you have less than 200 dirhams, which equals 5 uqiyas. Remember, 1 uqiyya is 40 dirhams. This threshold is based on the equivalence of 7 dinars to 10 dirhams. When your silver reaches 200 dirhams, you pay 1/40th, which is 5 dirhams. And again, any excess beyond that is calculated in the same manner. Now, the legal dirham used here is the Makan dirham, weighing 555 grains of middle barley corns. Each dinar weighs about 72 grains. It's important to note that the dirham is considered a measure as well as a weight, based on these standards. Gold and silver are treated as one category for zakat purposes. It's permitted to pay zakat on either one, depending on what you have. And you only pay zakat on these when you actually sell them, not just holding them. In the Malaki school of thought, zakat on gold and silver is calculated in this way, following these specific thresholds and ratios. This approach helps us understand when and how zakat is due, ensuring we fulfill our obligations properly and in accordance with Islamic guidelines. Today, I'll be explaining some important points about zakat on goods and merchandise. First, there is no zakat on goods unless they are intended for trading purposes. So, if you're holding goods for personal use, zakat generally doesn't apply. Goods can include a variety of items like slaves, real estate, land, clothes, wheat, all grains, fruits, and animals, especially when their value is less than the nisab, which is the minimum threshold for zakat obligation. When it comes to private property, there is consensus that zakat is not due on it. However, for merchandise or trading goods, there is an agreement that zakat is obligatory. Hoarding, which means keeping goods from the market to make a large profit later, clearly requires zakat. If you're a merchant who frequently turns over goods, meaning you don't hold on to inventory for long, then you need to assess your goods annually. This means you should calculate zakat on the value of your goods and cash at the end of each year, ensuring you fulfill your zakat obligation properly. Specifically, in the Malaki school, zakat on merchandise is emphasized, reinforcing the importance of this assessment for traders and merchants alike. Overall, understanding when and on what goods zakat is due helps us stay compliant and ensures we meet our spiritual and social responsibilities. Today, I want to clarify a common question about zakat on personal property. First of all, there is no zakat due on personal property. This includes things like your house, your horses, slaves or servants, and any private goods or belongings that you use for your own personal needs. The idea here is that zakat is not applicable to items that are for personal use and not for trade or wealth accumulation. Similarly, jewelry that you wear regularly is not subject to zakat because it's considered part of your personal use. However, if you have jewelry that you hold mainly for trade or investment purposes, then zakat does apply to those items. Now, moving to the Malaki school, which has its own rulings, they specify that zakat is applicable on property, but the context matters. So, whether it's land, buildings, or other assets, the key is understanding whether these items are held for personal use or for trade. This distinction is important because it connects to the overall theme of understanding what types of wealth and property are zakatable and which are not. It helps us ensure we're fulfilling our obligations correctly and not overpaying or underpaying zakat. Zakat is due on gold or silver that is extracted from mines, and this obligation starts as soon as the weight reaches 20 dinars for gold or 5 uqiyas for silver. At that point, 1/40th of the extracted amount must be paid immediately. It's important to note that there is no zakat on other mine materials like lead, copper, iron, or arsenic, unless they reach the minimum weight, which is the same as the nisab, and then zakat is due on that amount. The key point here is that the zakat is due on the extracted amount at the time it is taken out, not after a year or any other period. The Prophet's statement that there is no zakat on what is less than 5 uqiyas indicates that once the amount reaches 5 uqiyas, zakat becomes obligatory. This includes ore, not just pure gold or silver. It's also crucial to understand that the zakat is due immediately upon extraction, meaning the obligation is linked directly to the act of extraction itself, not to the passage of time. If work continues on the same deposit and more gold or silver is extracted, zakat continues to be due on each amount, regardless of how small, until that deposit is exhausted. However, if you start working on a new deposit, zakat is not due until the total extracted from that new deposit reaches the nisab threshold. Once it does, then zakat becomes obligatory on that new amount as well. This approach ensures that zakat is consistently paid on all extracted gold and silver, maintaining fairness and adherence to Islamic principles, and aligns with the broader theme of continuous charity and responsible wealth management. Today, I want to talk about the concept of treasure trove, or rikaz, and how it's treated in Islamic law. If someone comes across treasure that was buried during the Jahiliyyah, that is, before Islam, what happens? Well, this applies to gold, silver, and also other valuable things like pearls, copper, and lead. However, there's some disagreement among scholars about exactly what is included. The key point is that when treasure is found, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that there is a fifth, or comes, on treasure. That means 1/5 of its value must be given as a share to the state or for charitable purposes. Ibn Umar confirmed this ruling, but it's important to note that it's not always the case. If the treasure is found in the wilds of the land of Islam, it belongs to the person who discovers it. However, if it's found on someone's property, then it's considered their property by agreement. Now, what about treasures found in the sea, like amber, pearls, or jewelry that wash up on the shore? These belong to the person who finds them, and there's no requirement to pay a fifth on these items. But Al-Fakani noted that if there's evidence that ownership was previously protected, say by a Muslim or a dhimmi, then it might be different. To sum up, the rules about treasure trove highlight the importance of context, whether it's land or sea, and the circumstances of discovery. This connects to our broader theme of understanding how Islamic law guides us in managing valuable finds ethically and fairly. Let's talk about some important points regarding zakat on personal property. First, there is no zakat due on personal property such as slaves, servants, horses, or your own house. This also includes any goods or property for your personal use, like jewelry that you wear regularly. According to the hadith in the two Sahih collections, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, stated clearly, "There is no zakat owed by the Muslim on his slaves or horses." Similarly, jewelry worn by women, even if it belongs to a man, is not subject to zakat. However, if jewelry is rented out or intended for trade, then the rules change. In that case, zakat must be paid annually, based on its weight or value, if it reaches the minimum nisab threshold. The key takeaway here is that personal use items, like jewelry or houses, are generally exempt from zakat, but items kept for trade or business purposes do require zakat. The accepted position, supported by the Mutawana, is that zakat is not due on personal items unless they are intended for trade. Understanding these distinctions helps us properly fulfill our zakat obligations, especially when managing assets for personal use versus commercial purposes. In this part of the presentation, I want to clarify a key situation where zakat becomes due. This is when someone has wealth on which zakat is obligatory, but also has a debt that is equal to that wealth, or that reduces the zakatable property. For example, if a person owns goods like slaves, real estate, residences, garments, grains, dates, or animals that are less than the nisab, or even if they have some of these items on which zakat is due, they should consider that against their debt. If the debt equals the value of their zakatable assets, they can offset the debt against those assets before calculating zakat. Now, regarding real estate, it's important to distinguish between open land, meaning land without a lintel, and houses, which have a lintel. This difference affects how we classify the property for zakat purposes. Another important point is that if the wealth on which zakat is due is enough to settle the debt, and the person has held that wealth for a year, then they can deduct the debt from their zakatable assets before paying zakat. The 1-year period is counted from the time they own the wealth, and this applies to assets that can be sold to clear the debt. But what if your assets aren't enough to pay off the debt? In that case, you should calculate the difference, subtracting your assets from the debt, and then see what remains of your zakatable wealth. If, after this calculation, there's still enough wealth left that zakat is due, you are obligated to pay it. The zakat due is assessed on what remains after settling the debt. An additional point is about owed money, money that others owe you. You do not have to pay zakat on this until you actually receive the money. And if the debt has been outstanding for years, you only pay zakat on it once it's repaid, and only for that year. Finally, under the Malaki school, zakat on other assets and debts follows these principles. The focus is always on whether the assets can cover debts, and whether the assets have been held for a full year before zakat is due. This ensures that we handle debts and assets correctly, aligning with the overall principles of zakat. Now, let's discuss the key points about jizya, which is a tax historically levied on non-Muslims under Islamic law. Jizya is taken from men of the people of dhimma status, but only if they are both free and adult. It's important to note that women, children, and slaves are not required to pay jizya. The reason non-Muslims pay jizya is that it provides them with security and protection in exchange for the money they give. Essentially, they pay jizya because they receive security from the state. However, it's not taken from women, children, or slaves because, according to Islamic principles, the obligation to fight falls on men who are capable of defending themselves and the community. There are 4 key preconditions for someone to be liable for paying jizya. They must be male, an adult, free, and a believer in disbelief. That is, non-Muslim. Additionally, it's necessary that they socialize with the Muslim community. Jizya isn't paid by someone isolated in a monastery or hermitage. Also, the individual must remain an unbeliever. If they apostatize, they are no longer subject to jizya because their disbelief is not confirmed anymore. Sanity and the ability to pay are also essential. So, a madman or someone who is destitute and cannot afford to pay is exempt. Regarding the amount, for those who use gold, the jizya is 4 dinars, and for those who use silver, it's 40 dirhams. Importantly, the amount can be adjusted downward for those who are poor, to ensure that it remains fair and manageable. This framework reflects a balanced approach, protecting the community's interests while considering individual circumstances. It's a significant part of understanding how Islamic law historically managed relationships with non-Muslims.